Good morning once again, everyone. And let me share my screen. Just confirm that you're seeing my screen, everyone.
That's right.
Where am I? Where am I?
Lord, we don't know. Everywhere.
All right. Just a minute. All right. Where am I? Good. This is it. Yes. Just confirm once again.
Yes, I can see.
Good. So, as good morning once again, and was stated earlier, the title of this panel and my presentation specifically is Suicide Prevention, Learning from Socio-Cultural Perspective to Create a Sustainable Community Response. I learned from my experience in presenting at conferences that it's important to state your thesis at the very start of the presentation rather than in order to take an anticlimactic approach. So even if time runs out, the main statement that I want to contribute is already stated. And in this case, the thesis I'm putting forward here is that from a sociological standpoint, suicide is influenced, no doubt, by a complex interaction of factors existing on three levels of social reality. However, in the context of Guyana, the meso-level cultural factors are key in both understanding and effectively responding to suicide as a national social problem. What are these meso-level cultural factors? And I must explain here, must make clear that I'm not referring specifically to the contents of any culture or any cultural subsystem, but I'm referring here to the ambivalence created by competing cultural subsystems. And what do I mean by ambivalence? By ambivalence, the term as used here draws attention away from the contents of norms and values within culture and places emphasis on the fact of a conflict of values or conflict of norms between competing social or cultural subsystems. And I'll explain as I go down. To make my point or to substantiate my argument, what I present here are some data collected or obtained from the Ministry of Health between the years 2003 to 2007. And the data is disaggregated across by regions, disaggregated by ethnicity, disaggregated by age, and so. What we're seeing here is that in terms of raw numbers, in terms of frequency, between the years 2003 and 2007, the regions with the highest number of or highest occurrences of suicide were regions 4, 6, and then to a lesser extent, regions 2, 3, and 5. When we looked at the data in terms of suicide rate, suicide occurrences per one suicide, the occurrence of suicide per 100,000 persons by region, we see that region 6 has the highest suicide rate, which is followed by region 2 and then 3, 5, and 4. When the data is disaggregated by ethnicity, however, a very telling fact reveals itself. Suicide occurs predominantly among the Indo-Guyanese population, and that's a telling fact. And also, although the data that I just presented there was between 2003 and 2007, recent data provided by the Ministry of Health also shows that the realities that I've established by the facts established by the data, perpetuated themselves even up to 2020. I haven't seen data on 2021. 2021 is not closed as yet. We're near to the close, but it's not ended as yet. So the most recent I have is up to 2020. And this pie shows that almost 70%, 68% specifically, of the occurrences of suicide in Guyana occur among the Indo-Guyanese population. In terms of the age distribution, we see that the age group between 15 to 29, that's the age group with the highest occurrence, and then there is some gap, and then there is slightly lower but still significantly high amount of suicide among the 40 to 49 years old demographics. So yes, so before I go into that, the data establishes some significant facts, and the facts that are established by the data is that, one, suicide occurs predominantly among the Indo-Guyanese population, in some cases almost exclusively, and it's among the Indo-Guyanese male between the ages of 15 and 29. So, one, the rate is high among Indo-Guyanese. Secondly, it is high among Indo-Guyanese male. And thirdly, it's high among Indo-Guyanese male youth. So, this begs the question, what are the factors that are dominant within the Indo-Guyanese cultural system that feeds into that high tendency of suicide rate among the population? And I was influenced by Durkheim's theory of suicide, in which he teased out the relationship between levels of social integration or social capital within a society and suicide rate, and also the level of regulation within a society and suicide rate. And he came up with a classification of different types of suicide based on the different levels of integration and regulation, and which is represented here by this diagram. When integration or social integration or social capital is low, we see what is called egotistic suicide. When it's high, we see what is called altruistic suicide. When regulation is low, we see what is called anomic suicide, and when it's high, we experience what is called fatalistic suicide. So guided by this analytic framework, I went on to analyze some other data related to levels of social integration within the different communities in Guyana, the different ethnic groups, and the different regions, so as to see to what extent variations in social integration or variations in social regulation are operationalized here as norms and values and so forth, to what extent there are relationship between these variables and the suicide rate as proposed by Durkheim. What I have here is a table displaying different dimensions of social integration and suicide rate for all 10 regions. Interestingly, and the data that is used to arrive at these calculations were sourced from the National Census in 2002, the Government of Guyana Poverty Reduction Strategy paper in 2011, and GCOM's voting record for the 26th election. And what we've seen, the regions with the highest suicide rate, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, are also the regions with the highest level of political integration and also the highest level of social integration. It's the reverse, however, for religious integration. So, coming back to Durkheim, Durkheim argues that when there is a breakdown in social integration, we see manifest what is called egotistic suicide. And but according to the data, the political integration, social integration, both dimensions of social integration broadly, or societal integration broadly speaking, are very high in the Indo-Guyanese community. So the type of suicide that we're experiencing or seeing is definitely not egotistic suicide as postulated by Durkheim. There's no breakdown in social solidarity or social capital among Indo-Guyanese group. In fact, it is the very opposite. Suicide, therefore, cannot be categorized as egotistic suicide, and this has important implications for policy and intervention. The tools that we use to treat someone whose behavior arises from a sense of loss, loneliness, disconnectedness from the larger community or society or ethnic group might be different from the tools we use or from the tools that are required to intervene in behaviors influenced by other factors. So it's important to know what are the factors that are influencing this high rate of suicide in order to inform our intervention. So what I've seen is based on empirical work done by Dans in 2004, George Dans in 2004, in the research report that is known as the title of which is The Shadow of Death, and by current research by our colleague that is right on the panel here, Dalgetty Dean. Our work is forthcoming, but there's a similarity that runs across the different studies. And one of the main factors that contribute to the suicide rate based on the data they collected is family problems. So that led me to ask, what are these problems within the families that are influencing high levels of suicide rate among the Indo-Guyanese population? And I postulate here that the cultural norms of the Indo-Guyanese cultural subsystem are at odds with the larger Creole or globalized cultural system. And I've identified two of these for discussion, but there are more but the time does not allow us to really get into some of them. Let's deal with the norms of collectivity, and which are expressed in the need by the parent to dictate to children issues related to various aspects of their personal lives, and more importantly, choice of partner. Also the norms of achievement. The combination of these norms result in conflict between the older generation or parents and the forthcoming or younger generation, children, because children now are living in a global society that are based on values of individuality and freedom and so forth. And those values are competing with values of a very closely knitted community where parents still desire to preserve the privilege of directing and dictating what happens in the life or the future of their children, and at a very high level. So what we are seeing here, as I'm postulating, is that the younger generation are rebelling against the diktats of the older generation. And this is occurring within a context of political, cultural, economic competition in the larger social system. Because the larger social system, we would know that Guyana is an ethnically plural society. Because of the competition among cultural, political, and ethnic units in the larger social system, the old generation sees it as their responsibility to dictate or to guide the younger generation and to equip them with the tools that are necessary to successfully navigate this competition. So, which would explain the norms of achievement. Parents would place a high amount of pressure on children to achieve in various aspects of their life, especially financially, educationally, and so forth. And of course, parents place a high degree of pressure on children with regards to their choice of partner. And this, I haven't shown the slide with the breakdown of suicide rate across genders. The suicide occurs predominantly among the Indo-Guyanese male. So that pressure is brought to bear more on the Indo-Guyanese male than the Indo-Guyanese female. So this brings us back to Durkheim and his analytic theoretical framework. And having said what I said, how does this, my postulate, fits into Durkheim's theory of suicide? What we are experiencing, as explained before, is a situation where in the Indo-Guyanese cultural subsystem, we have high degree of, or high levels of social integration, and we also have high levels of relative, and these are, I'm speaking here in relative term, and we also have high levels of social regulation. And as I explained before, social regulation operationalizes or expresses itself as norms and the values that the generation before imposes on the emerging generation. So what we're seeing is not fatalistic suicide, which results only from high regulation, or altruistic suicide, which results only from high integration, but a combination of two, and which I want to refer to as defiant, a kind of defiant suicide, where the young generation, as according to the data, it's primarily the youth between 15 and 29, that young generation is faced with an ambivalent situation, faced with a certain pattern of socialization in the family and maybe by extension the community, but they're caught up in a larger cultural context that is influenced by values and ideas about freedom, individuality, and personal choice, and so forth. So that ambivalence at times and the pressure that is brought to bear from family result in a situation where the youngsters are forced to rebel, and they rebel in some choose to rebel in a very fatal way, but also in a very defiant way. So what we are seeing, according to my postulate, is a type of suicide that I would want to refer to as defiant suicide. And if this is the case, then we must reconceptualize the ways, the intervention strategies. It's not egotistic suicide, so the clinical psychological approach by itself might not be sufficient. I've seen, in terms of intervention, the government before this current regime as doubling down on providing call centers, help hotlines, and so forth, so that persons with suicidal tendencies and so forth could call and get counseling and so. And from the data that I've seen, many persons are indeed calling, but apparently the suicide rate is not being positively affected, which means that we have to rethink our intervention. We have to supplement our current approach to intervening with other approaches. And those approaches should happen at the level of the family, in combination with the counseling that we're already providing. We should have maybe workshops in community conflict resolution, anger management for both parents and children, and for partners, because there's another category of suicide that I haven't touched here, but maybe Dalgety Dean will touch on, suicide that results from relationship issues. Then we might also have to think about intervention at the community level. Victims need to be assured that they are helped outside of the immediate family. and there should be groups within the community, such as the extended family, the community organization, religious organizations, that persons can turn to in the event of having problem with within their family structure. So we need intervention, of course, at the level of the individual, which I think is already being provided, but we also need intervention at the level of the family, at the level of the communities, and so forth. And lastly, which is a more radical approach, but it's here for discussion. I can remember a couple of years ago when Professor Mars was murdered by a group of teenagers. The Child Care Agency argued that we might have to start holding parents accountable for delinquent behavior that leads to these kinds of outcome. And maybe it's up for debate. Maybe when we see cases where youths are forced to take their lives directly on account of behavior or actions by the parent, we might have to start thinking about holding parents to account. It's difficult, but it's up to debate. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Edwards. Time is against us. It's developing well. Now we transition to Mr. Rocks. We have probably another 30